Now, it's just 1 week to go until further lockdown restrictions will be eased in England. It will be over a year since some would have hugged a loved one, something almost unthinkable before the pandemic. From next Monday, as well as hugs, foreign holidays will also be back on the cards. But how does the decision to relax the rules stack up against the number of cases in the UK? Well, let's speak to Dr. Duncan Robertson. He's an academic in policy and strategy and analytics at Loughborough University. Professor, thank you so much for talking to us. Where are we with cases in the country?
Well, we're actually doing quite well in cases. So if you look at these heat maps, and these are going from around December, when it went through this very high cases around January, when we had to have the lockdown. And we're now on this right-hand side, and at the top, you're looking at cases which are very low, actually, for the over 80s. And this is they're actually the lowest since they've been in March 2020. And this is really quite excellent news, to do with the lockdown, but also to do with the vaccination. So this is what's really looking very good. And also, I suppose one thing is we're still getting reasonable number of cases in the 10 to 19-year-olds, but of course there's mass testing with children at secondary schools. So, it's not over, but it's definitely looking fairly positive.
And you mentioned vaccines there. How are we doing with that? It's over 50 million now, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. 50 million total doses. And if you look at the slide for vaccinations, once again, we're going from the beginning of the vaccination programme up to today. So you've got sort of 95% of 75, 80-year-olds who've been vaccinated, which is really tremendous. So what is, one thing to mention is that we don't have everybody vaccinated, and particularly for under 40s, they're a fairly susceptible group of people. But also, it's not split equally. So if you look at Black and Black British people, around 65% of those are vaccinated, adults are vaccinated, compared to 95% of white people in the over 50s. So it's there are still vulnerable people around in the community.
Professor, how do we know whether it's the lockdown or the vaccines driving the cases down?
Well, I think it's a matter of it's both. So really, we can look at when people got the vaccines and how long it would take for those to kick in. And really, we're seeing the major factor is through the lockdowns. But as I said, if you look at the numbers of people in the over 80s who are now getting cases, it's very low. And I think we can attribute quite a lot of that to the vaccination program, which is really brilliant. And of course, this is one of those tests that we have, that the vaccination program is continuing successfully, which it certainly is.
As lockdown continues to lift, are we going to see cases rising, even if it is just marginally?
Well, who knows? We can, and that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to sort of see. We can't, predict with 100% accuracy what's going to happen, but we're already starting to see, for example, in Bolton, we're starting to see certain outbreaks happening, and we're not going to see uniformly all the cases coming down across the country, because that's just not how it works. We're going to see particular communities and particular areas which are still going to get cases. And that's why surveillance that Public Health England does is so important, about knowing where the cases are, what variants they are, and making sure that mitigation measures are put in place.
The focus has always been to keep the pressure off the NHS. How are we looking in terms of hospitalisations?
Well, once again, we're still looking at very low levels compared to the peak, and of course it depends where you look. So if you look at the chart for hospital admissions, you can see huge numbers of people, particularly older people, per 100,000 being admitted in January, but now we're at relatively low levels. So certainly, if you look at the tests in terms of hospitalizations, the vaccines seem to be doing very positive things there. And the other test in the roadmap is that there isn't a surge, which would put unsustainable pressure on the NHS. And that certainly seems to be the case now. But once again, as we unlock, there is, of course, the risk that we start getting resurgences.
Let's talk about risk and this issue of variants. Just have a look at what's happening in India. The reason we're back in this lockdown that we're currently in is because of the Kent variant. I mean, how do we know that once we start unlocking, we're not going to see more variants coming up?
Well, I think we're inevitably, I mean, we are looking at a large number of variants. And of course, they go through being monitored to being variants under investigation. And what we saw with the India variant, which is now called B1617.2, that's the orange one in the bottom right-hand corner, which is going up fairly rapidly. We've got about 500 cases of those. And what Public Health England are doing is they're really looking at the risk of these. And of course, it's a risk compared to what we have at the moment. Of course, we have a very transmissible variant ourselves in the UK. So if you look at the India variant, it's around 5% of the cases that are sequenced at the moment. It is more transmissible than what we call the wild type, and it's around the same amount of transmissibility, or even slightly higher than the Kent variant. So, you know, all these things are based around risk. You know, the pandemic isn't over. Hopefully, it's going to the end, but it's all thinking about what we can do when we do open up, as I'm sure we will. Mitigating those risks. So, for example, indoors, ventilation, and not really getting too complacent.
I'm just looking at the variants, South Africa, Brazil, Japan, Philippines. How do we keep them out? If we're going to open up our borders, foreign travel is going to start again next Monday. How are we going to keep these variants out of the UK?
Well, I think we're not going to keep all of them out of the UK. And as you can see with the sort of exotic names that some of those variants have, they've first been detected in other countries. And of course, you know, we have our own homegrown 117 variant, which has done has caused a lot of cases in the UK. So politically, it does seem as though there is a desire for travel. You know, we'd all like to go somewhere exotic for our holidays, but hopefully not bringing back the virus, exotic viruses when we do. So what is good is there is a red list, and that certain destinations which have high cases and potentially high variants are kept out, but people will find a way to go, and even via Portugal, which is now opening up. It's not as though Portugal's isolated from the rest of the world. There will still be people going into Portugal, and so it's really the virus will find a route. So it's all about this balance of risk and reward.
Okay, Professor Robertson from Loughborough Uni, thanks a lot for talking to us.